All right, I'm going to be talking about building JSON APIs with Django and Pinax. I like to say building Django backends for the modern world because I feel like web application architecture has changed so drastically over the last several years. Several years ago, when the iPhone was introduced, we had no idea what this little device could do and what it would change to our expectations. Fast forward to today, and we have an app for nearly everything that we're putting onto the web. Building a web app is so much more than just the traditional Django model view template. There's so much more that goes into it. The view layer is becoming more complex. And we need to implement APIs to let the smarter, richer clients be able to interact with our data. So before I get started, let me talk a little bit about myself here. My name is Brian Rosner. I live in Denver, Colorado with my wife, and we have a baby due in October. I work as a chief architect at Eldarion. Eldarion is a web agency where we build web apps using Django and Pinax. I work on Pinax at work. I have the privilege to be able to work on Pinax, but also in my spare time. And I'll speak a little bit more about Pinax in a moment. Eldarion also recently open sourced a PaaS, a platform as a service, named Kel. It's the foundation for our commercial Eldarion cloud PaaS, which was originally named Gondor. And Kel itself uses much of what I'm talking about here today. And it also helps drive the development forward on Pinax in the API work. But enough about me. I'm here to talk about Pinax-api. Pinax-api was built out of some requirements we had for a development project we had at Eldarion. The goal of Pinax-api is to provide a few primitives for building good RESTful APIs. Using Django and Pinax that will be implemented. Hopefully these sorts of APIs that we build for these apps are going to be used throughout the whole Pinax ecosystem. Before I get too far into Pinax-api, I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about Pinax itself. So Pinax is an open source platform built on Django. It has a standard project layout which if you're familiar with Django, as we all are, you would do a Django admin start project, and you get a project. And that has some conventions that are already baked into it. So Pinax kind of builds upon that and provides even more convention around things that are more specific, such as through our starter projects, we have various starter projects, like account, social project, that kind of are more tailored towards a specific set of requirements you may have for building your site. And also, these starter projects are made up of reusable apps. There's a lot of reusable apps that we have in the Pinax ecosystem, and they're all used as the building blocks of these starter projects to actually implement the functionalities that are in there. And then default templates, there are a lot of default templates that we provide out of the box with Pinax, so you don't have to worry about spending time building out various views and the way that they look. You can rely on something like Bootstrap or other CSS frameworks to actually do that stuff for you, and you can just focus on the stuff that makes your site different. And so like I mentioned earlier, the reasoning for Pinax-api was due to requirements of an Eldarion development project. During our discovery and research phase, we came across the JSON API specification. This specification provided a lot of clarity on building APIs, and specifically RESTful APIs, and eliminated all the bike shedding that came about with how is the JSON payload structured. Because you can go on and on days about whether or not the key is here or there, or how it's going to be ultimately structured, and this just takes care of all of that. Let's see here. Yep. JSON API itself was a big reason why we decided to build Pinax-api. Django REST Framework is the obvious choice. It's a very well-structured, very well-architected app, and it didn't quite work well when I looked at a lot of the different resources that are available to connect JSON API to Django REST Framework and be able to take advantage of all of the components of the of JSON API, such as relationships and stuff, and I'll go a little more into that. And I do need to admit there's a hint of not invented here syndrome, but I justify it because we wanted to take full advantage of the spec. And marry it with Pinax in some very specific ways that really only the build from the ground up approach was going to be able to do. So this is an actual flow chart that we had with the development client at Eldarion. I say this is an increasingly common modern application architecture, largely through the experience that I've had at Eldarion with regard to the different sorts of architectures we've been building out for our customers. At the top there, you have the database where all your data lives, and it's being exposed as an API. And traditionally, the view of the application is that a lot of times this is all kind of in one code base, in one process. But that's changing quite a bit because a lot of times you end up needing to actually split off these front ends as they're either their own project because you need to implement it in a different language. And in this particular case, it was because we need to implement these front ends, or specifically the shop front end, in Node, React.js, and Redux. So looking towards the future of a project like this, it isn't going to be a big surprise when the client comes up and says, we need to add an iOS and Android app. It just becomes a new front end that's able to communicate with the API. So a little bit more about JSON API itself. There's the JSONAPI.org is the URL that actually talks about the specification itself. There's going to be a lot more in-depth details available there that I'm not going to be able to get into here. The way that I look at the specification is as an object graph. And the object graph is naturally, as a developer, you're going to be creating these object graphs in your applications through the creation of your models that you create in your Django project, et cetera. My specification is optimized. It's optimized in a way that creates efficient writes, and you can also design it in a way to have really efficient. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. It enables efficient reads, but you can design it in a way that makes it great for efficient writes as well. For example, let's say you have a blog post, and the blog post is being requested by your front end, and your front end actually needs to display the comments as well. Well, that could actually be turned into 2 different HTTP requests, but that's going to increase latency for your front ends. So the way that JSON API works is that you can actually use relationships in compound documents to say, I want the blog post, but I also want its comments, or I also want its author, all in the same payload. So you don't have to go ask for this information over and over again. Also, JSON API it's registered with the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, so it's actually available as a specific content type application via the API plus JSON. So some of the design influences that I had when I was building pinax-api, it was Kubernetes. Kubernetes wasn't something that I pulled something specifically from, but it has a really great HTTP API that I used as the influence, the basis of kind of the thinking that I had with regard to APIs in general. Django is obviously a big influence because I wanted to make sure that pinax-api was something that worked really well with Django, because I think that's really important. Django REST Framework also was a big influence in the way that pinax-api came about, because some of the architectural bits that are available, the way that it's designed, in this case, the copy from the flattery is to copy. So this is, I think, a perfect example of that. And Pinax as well with the ecosystem, because these applications are changing so drastically with the requirements we need to implement. I wanted to make sure that this is something that works well for that, because that's what Pinax is trying to solve as well. So I'm going to get into a little bit more details of the specific API primitives that are available in pinax-api. You have the API resource, and the resource is the representation of the data to the outside world. Relationships, which link data together. For example, an author to a blog post. An endpoint set, which is a derivative of a Django view class. Different HTTP methods are mapped to different instance methods, forming a RESTful interface. So let's talk a little more about an API resource in particular. A pinax-api resource, you can think of it as kind of like a Django form, but without any validation. This is really important to think about in this way, because you think, well, if the data's there, that's where we need to validate it, because you're dealing with untrusted input. the way that this is designed is that the API resource is actually completely agnostic to where the data is sourced. And then there's ultimately helpers that are used in the endpoints, which we'll go over here in a little bit, that link it to the data sets. So the reason why this is done this way is for portability. So for example, this here doesn't necessarily need to be tied specifically to a data source. It's tied to the representation of the data, which allows it to be portable and used inside at the client layer as well. And some particular design decisions that were made around this was that you'd be able to encapsulate this in its own project that's separated from the project that actually implements how to get this data. And then that can also be used as your client that talks back to your API. And that keeps it all together nicely. The model layer is what implements your validation. So in this case, we have an author, which is just a Django model that you would build just in Django. The validation lives there using Django model validation. So all your validation would already be encapsulated through your model. And then the pinax-api will call right into that. The model could actually even be a DIT. It doesn't even need to be a Django model. It could be anything that you can pull data from, input data into. Pinax-api uses relationship information to serialize linkage. So a relationship defines how you link data together. We have here the same resource, but actually adds in the relationship information here. So a relationship can either be a non-collection, which would be a many to one, maybe being many authors to one publisher, or it can be a collection, which in this case would be an author has posts. And the post is being defined here using, so the string values that are there as the first argument are actually the API type that are all being registered as you create your resources through the API.register. And then it's able to kind of build up this graph, and it will know how to serialize it once it comes time to serialize the data. So an API endpoint set. An API endpoint set is kind of what binds the resources to the HTTP methods. So when you perform a GET, it's going to get translated into, in pinax-api, into a retrieve method where you would actually implement the logic, and I'll show it here in a second. An API resource endpoint set is actually derives from the endpoint set itself, and that's largely what you use to create the endpoint set that link the resource to the endpoint set. All of the URLs are automatically generated, and it provides a simple validation, a very simple validation primitive to actually connect the data to the resource, and I'll show it here in the next slide here. This is the first part of it, because this can get really long once you've implemented your actual resource handling of an author in this case. So here we actually are importing the resource. We are binding the endpoint set to the resource, the author resource, and this is where you define the kind of the basic bits of the author and how it's going to hook up into your URL. So there's a base name, which is just largely it's just the singular name of the model or whatever the data model is, and then the base regex, which actually defines kind of where it's going to live in your URL namespace, but it's done at the collection level, and then the lookup actually defines how it will look for the individual object that's inside that collection. So in this case, the field is a PK. So if you actually kind of think of a URL conf, it kind of all this all kind of gets compiled down into the single regex, which would be authors with the PK be mapped out of it. And then these are the methods that you would define in your endpoint set to actually link everything all together. So you have a list, retrieve, create, update, destroy, which roughly map into a get on the collection, a get on the individual endpoint or the individual object, a post on the collection, and then a put on the individual object, and ultimately a delete on the individual object. And the validation primitive inside of create and update is through the validate method, which actually just says, on this particular resource class, I'm going to validate this data, and it passes, and the resource actually defers it off to whatever the model is. And you can actually write whatever validation logic you want in that with statement, and it'll handle all the API errors that come right back out of that. So for example, if the name needed to have the letter A in it, or whatever the requirements may be, it can raise the validation error, and the context manager will take care of turning that into your API errors for you. You don't have to write any of that logic at all. And the same applies for the update. There's a lot of other features that are available in the pinax-api that I'm not going to be able to get into a lot of the details of. Authentication is one. Are you who you say you are? Permissions, can you access a given resource? Those are all built into the pinax-api that can help those individual methods ensure that the right person and the person that you can trust is actually accessing them. And then the other big bit of pinax-api that is really helpful is using API Blueprint, which is actually a specification for writing documentation that's machine readable, is automatically generated through all of your endpoint sets. And then you can actually define specific customizations to that documentation. And what's nice about leveraging API Blueprint is that you have the ability to leverage all of the tooling that's available in its ecosystem. So one really neat thing is that you can actually write out your you can write your API using pinax-api, and then use one of the tooling that enables you to actually generate a client without having to actually write any client code, and it can be in any language. Because all the tooling in their ecosystem supports a ton of different languages. And that's just all available at an individual endpoint that you can hook up. And that is everything that I have. You can actually look at pinax-api's code is on GitHub, github.com/pinax. /pinax-api. There's a ton of documentation there that goes into really great detail on how to actually do a lot of the stuff that I've described here with a lot of examples. And my website and my Twitter. And if you need any help on any of this stuff, you can check out Pinax's Slack and YouTube, or even on GitHub, right on the pinaxproject.com, which I guess I didn't put there. You can get there through the GitHub URL, though. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. I ask you to wait for the microphone so we can pick it up.
Hi, so I'm not completely sure if this question is valid, but I'm wondering, how does this complement or differentiate from JSON RPC? So JSON API versus JSON RPC.
I haven't seen JSON RPC, but in that particular case, it'd be an RPC, a remote procedure call, that would be done more about actually serializing the actual method calls that would translate into something specifically that would already be written in your Python code. This is actually kind of providing a layer between how you actually call into this versus the code that you're writing. So something that would work really well, that would fit inside of a Django project.
Another question?
Hi. My question is, can you provide concrete examples or point me to a link or something that I can clearly compare pinax-api against Django REST framework, or provide real cases when you see Django REST framework, this doesn't work for me?
Yeah, so our documentation actually has a lot of examples of how you might integrate with real Django models, like blog posts and stuff. I'm not sure if how it would look compared to Django REST framework, but you can see a lot of the things like, I need to accomplish this one thing. Let's say, for example, I need to expose blog posts. You could see how that would look and how it all connects, and then you can easily hit it using just some curl or whatever to kind of see what it looks like when the data comes back. The JSON API, the specification, their website has a ton of information about exactly the way that data is going to come back and how you would expect it and how you might implement a client that actually does interact with that API. And there's a lot of, because it's built off that specification, there's a lot of other clients already built that know how to speak that through that specification. Does that answer your question?
briefly.
I mean, the Django REST framework actually added JSON API support in the last version,
Did they? Okay.
3.4. So that's why I'm asking about the concrete difference.
Yes, yeah, we started this project back in January, so at the time there wasn't much other than some formatters that were third party that you can install with Django REST Framework that will actually take the already serialized format of Django REST Framework and translate that into JSON API so you can use any clients that already have it. Whereas the point of this one was to hopefully get something that was actually native to JSON API that was able to take advantage of all of the bits of the specification, such as relationships and the compound documents and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure, I haven't seen the stuff that they put into Django REST Framework recently, so I'd have to look at that.
Pretty much what like last week.
Oh yeah, see, that's way too new for me. I was working on this instead.
Let's have a hand for Brian Rosner.